The airport was busy that morning. People rushed from gate to gate, holding coffee cups, bags, and tickets. Among the crowd walked a tall black man in a sharp navy blue suit. His steps were calm. His face was peaceful. He carried only a small, leather bag. His name was Mr. Jordan Wells. He moved through security with ease. The staff looked at him but said little. Some smiled politely, unsure who he was. He smiled back quietly. At the gate, he handed his boarding pass to the flight attendant. She scanned it, looked confused, then smiled awkwardly. "First class?" she asked, as if she didn't believe it. "Yes," Mr. Wells replied kindly. She gave a fake smile and nodded. "Enjoy your flight," she said, but her voice was cold. He walked toward the plane. Inside the aircraft, the flight crew was preparing for takeoff. Passengers were getting settled. A tall white pilot stood near the first-class cabin, laughing with a co-pilot. Captain Rick Donovan had been flying for 20 years. He was known for being confident, but also for making rude jokes. Today was no different. When he saw Mr. Wells walking toward first class, he raised an eyebrow. He nudged the co-pilot. "You see this? Looks like someone's lost," he whispered. The co-pilot chuckled. Mr. Wells heard it, but kept walking, calm, silent. He reached his seat, 1A, window side, and sat down with grace. Captain Rick walked past him, pretending to check the luggage bins. Then he leaned down a little and said with a smirk, "Sir, this is first class." Mr. Wells looked up and replied, "I know." Rick stood straight, gave a half laugh, and walked back to the cockpit. "That'll be fun," he muttered. A young boy sitting with his mother in economy watched it all. He had brown skin like Mr. Wells. His eyes followed the man's every move. He whispered, "Mom, that man in the suit. Did you see how they looked at him?" His mother nodded but said nothing. She looked sad. Back in first class, Mr. Wells put on his seatbelt and looked out the window. The seat next to him was empty. He didn't seem bothered. He was used to this kind of treatment. This wasn't the first time. A flight attendant walked by to offer drinks. She skipped over him, gave water to others but not him. She didn't even look at him. Mr. Wells noticed, but stayed quiet. Instead, he pulled out his phone and checked something. Then it rang. He answered it softly. "Yes, I've boarded. I'm seated in 1A. A pause. "Yes, let them know I'll join the meeting right after landing." Another pause. "No, don't tell them who I am yet. Let's see how the rest of this flight goes." He smiled slightly as he ended the call. The same flight attendant walked by again. This time she glanced at him. Maybe she had heard the call. Her expression changed a little, but she still said nothing. Meanwhile, back in the cockpit, Captain Rick laughed again. "That guy in 1A, he said, shaking his head. "Wearing a suit doesn't make you first class." The co-pilot chuckled, nervously. "Maybe he upgraded last minute." "Doubt it," Rick replied. "He doesn't belong up here." Just then, the senior flight attendant walked into the cockpit. "Captain, we're ready for takeoff." Rick nodded. "Let's get this bird in the air." He took one last sip of his coffee and said, "Hope Mr. Fancy Suit enjoys the ride. First and last time, I bet." The plane began to roll onto the runway. In seat 1A, Mr. Wells sat quietly, watching the clouds. His phone buzzed once more. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from someone named Chairman Davis. "Good luck today. I trust you'll observe the crew carefully." Mr. Wells smiled. He put the phone away and whispered to himself, "Let's see how high respect flies today." The plane was now in the air, high above the clouds. Passengers had settled in. Some were watching movies. Others were sleeping. But in the cockpit, Captain Rick was still laughing. "Man, I can't believe that guy's sitting in 1A like he owns the place," he said to the co-pilot. The co-pilot gave a weak smile. "He's quiet, though. Not causing trouble." Rick leaned. back in his seat and shook his head. That's how they do it, he muttered. They stay quiet. Until they want something. He picked up the cabin phone and called the front. In the first-class cabin, the lead flight attendant answered the call. "Yes, Captain?" Rick's voice came through. "Make sure Mr. First Class doesn't try anything funny. You know how it goes. Dress nice, act calm, but always some drama." The attendant glanced toward seat 1A. Mr. Wells was quietly reading a document on his tablet. He hadn't moved much. He hadn't even asked for water. She felt uneasy. But she replied, "Understood, Captain." A few rows behind, a businessman in a suit leaned over to whisper to another passenger. "Who does he think he is? Sitting up here like that?" His seatmate shrugged. "Maybe he's rich." The businessman scoffed. "I've flown for 20 years. Never seen someone like him in this section." Mr. Wells heard it. He didn't turn. He didn't respond. He just smiled slightly, as if he knew something they didn't. Back in economy class, the young black boy from earlier was still watching. He leaned toward his mother. "Mom, they're being mean to him." "Why?" His mother looked at him and said gently, "Some people see your color before they see your worth." The boy frowned. "But he didn't do anything." "I know," she said softly. "And that's what makes it worse." Suddenly, the lead flight attendant's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen. It was a message from head office. Her eyes widened. She quickly walked toward the cockpit. Inside, Captain Rick was still smirking. "Bet you anything he's a YouTuber, or a preacher or something. The kind who posts videos for attention." The flight attendant opened the door quickly and whispered, "Captain, you need to see this." He looked annoyed. "What now?" She held up her phone. One message, one name. His eyes scanned it. Then he went silent. He read it again, then a third time. His face turned pale. "No," he whispered. "This can't be right." The co-pilot leaned over. "What? What's going on?" The flight attendant whispered. "That man in seat 1A. "He's not just a passenger." Captain Rick swallowed hard. "He's on the executive review board." The cockpit was no longer full of jokes. Captain Rick sat frozen in his seat. His hands trembled as he held the phone. The message from head office was short, but powerful. "Jordan Wells, Executive Vice President, evaluates pilots and crew performance. Onboard your flight." The co-pilot leaned closer. "Wait, you're saying that guy is—" Rick nodded slowly. "He's one of the top people in the company." He swallowed hard. "And I just laughed at him, insulted him, right in front of my crew." Back in the cabin, Mr. Wells was calm. He took a sip of water. The flight attendant had finally brought it, her hands shaking slightly. She smiled, nervously. "Sorry for the delay, sir." Mr. Wells smiled kindly and said, "It's all right." She nodded and hurried off. The senior flight attendant walked back into the cockpit. "Captain," she said quietly, "should we apologize to him now?" Rick shook his head. "No. No sudden moves. Let's finish the flight. We don't want to make it worse." The co-pilot looked nervous. "But he heard you, didn't he, when you joked about him?" Rick didn't answer. He stared straight ahead and muttered, "I might have just destroyed my career." In first class, Mr. Wells looked down at his phone again. Another message from the chairman. "Let me know how the staff treats you. We've had complaints about that crew before." He looked around. The passengers still whispered. The pilot hadn't said a word since takeoff. The energy in the cabin had shifted. Mr. Wells leaned back in his seat and whispered to himself, "Let's see what respect looks like after turbulence." Meanwhile, the little boy in economy was still watching him. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, I think that man's important." She smiled. "Yes, baby, he is." The boy asked, "Is he a boss?" She looked at Mr. Wells, sitting calmly. "No, I think he's the boss." Back in the cockpit, the captain finally spoke. "All right," he said. After landing, I'll say something. I'll explain. The co-pilot raised his eyebrows. Explain? You mocked a senior executive, Rick snapped. I didn't know who he was. The co-pilot answered quietly. That's the problem. You judged him before even knowing his name. Rick had no reply. Then came the final call from the airline's head office, directly to the cockpit radio. The senior attendant answered. Yes? Calm voice said, Please inform Captain Rick that Mr. Wells will report to the board immediately after landing. He has full authority, and his decision will be final. The attendant froze. The message was clear. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a test, and Rick had already failed. In seat 1A, Mr. Wells closed his eyes. He remembered years ago when he sat in the back of the plane dreaming of one day, flying first class. Not for the seat, but for the respect. Now he had the seat. But the respect? That was still boarding late. The plane was still in the air, flying steady above the clouds, but inside, the air was tense. Captain Rick kept his eyes on the controls, but his mind was somewhere else. He had made jokes. He had laughed. He had looked down on a man who now had the power to end his career, and that man was sitting just a few feet behind him. In first class, Mr. Jordan Wells closed his eyes again, resting his head gently. He wasn't asleep. He was thinking about all the people like him, who had been treated unfairly, who had been judged by the color of their skin instead of their character. This moment wasn't just about him, it was bigger. Suddenly, the captain's voice came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be landing in about 25 minutes. Thank you for flying with us today. His voice shook just slightly. The passengers didn't notice, but Mr. Wells did. He smiled faintly. He knew the fear had started to settle in. The co-pilot leaned toward Rick and whispered, Are you going to talk to him? Rick didn't answer right away. I don't know what to say. The co-pilot replied softly. You treated him like he didn't belong. Maybe now, you should ask why he does. In economy class, the little boy leaned toward the window. Mom, are we almost there? His mom nodded. Yes. Then the boy asked, Do you think that man will forgive them? She smiled and said, Good people don't need to shout to be strong. They just let truth speak for them. As the flight began, its descent, the senior flight attendant returned to Mr. Wells. She bent down and whispered nervously, Sir, the captain would like to speak with you after landing, if that's okay. Mr. Wells looked at her gently. I'll be available, he said. She nodded and walked away, trying to hide her fear. Back in the cockpit, Rick took off his headset for a moment. He stared at the flight log in silence. I've made mistakes, he whispered. The co-pilot looked at him and said quietly, Everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone gets judged by them. The way he has. Rick nodded slowly, and for the first time in a long time, he felt small. Just before landing, Mr. Wells checked his phone again. Another message from the chairman. Ready to hear your report. Your call will decide what happens next. He looked out the window as the city below came into view. Then, he whispered, Let's give them one last chance to show respect. The wheels touched down. The plane slowed. The runway passed by. The captain's voice returned. Welcome to your destination. We thank you for flying with us. But this time, there was no joke in his voice. Only fear. Only guilt. Mr. Wells stood up, calm and confident. Other passengers watched him now with new eyes. Whispers filled the cabin. Is that the man the pilot disrespected? I heard he's a high-ranking executive. He didn't even say a word the whole flight. As he stepped off the plane, the lead flight attendant and Captain Rick were waiting at the jet bridge. The captain stood straight, but his voice cracked as he said, Mr. Wells, I owe you an apology. Mr. Wells looked at him and said nothing. The silence was louder than any words. Captain Rick stood stiffly near the gate. His uniform was perfect, but inside he was falling apart. Across from him stood Mr. Jordan Wells, the man he had laughed at, the man who now held his career in his hands. Rick cleared his throat. "Mr. Wells, I want to say I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I made assumptions. I disrespected you. Mr. Wells raised his hand gently to stop him. "It's not about me," he said calmly. "It's about how you treat everyone." Rick's face dropped. The truth hit him hard. Outside the gate, a car was waiting for Mr. Wells, but he didn't enter right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone. He opened a special secure app. One button, one call. Inside a tall building at the airline's headquarters, a boardroom phone began to ring. A man in a gray suit, the chairman, answered it. "Jordan," he said, "we're ready for your report." Back at the airport, Mr. Wells stepped aside, calm and steady. The call connected. He spoke clearly. "Flight 207, first-class cabin, crew professionalism, below standard, pilot conduct, highly inappropriate. He mocked a passenger without cause." That passenger was me. There was silence on the other end. Then the chairman asked, "What do you recommend?" Mr. Wells looked back. Captain Rick was still standing by the door, watching him, ashamed, nervous, exposed. The flight attendants whispered nearby. They all knew, everyone now knew. Mr. Wells finally replied, "He shouldn't be in a position of leadership, not with that mindset. My vote is clear." He ended the call. Meanwhile, the co-pilot walked quietly past Rick. He looked at him for a moment and said, "I learned something today." "But I don't think you did." "Until it was too late." Then he walked away. Rick didn't stop him. He just stared at the floor. A few moments later, Mr. Wells's car pulled up. He opened the door, ready to leave. But before he stepped in, a familiar voice spoke. "Excuse me, sir." It was the little black boy from the flight, standing nearby with his mom. The boy looked up and said, "Are you a king?" Mr. Wells smiled. "No," he said. "I'm just a man who didn't let them break me." The boy's mother smiled and said softly, "Thank you for showing him that we belong anywhere." Mr. Wells nodded once, got in the car, and closed the door. The driver pulled away. Inside the airport, Rick's phone buzzed. It was a message from the airline. "Report received. You are temporarily suspended pending further review." His hands shook. He had mocked a stranger, and that stranger had turned out to be his final test. The news traveled fast. By the next morning, the airline's name was all over the internet. Pilot disrespects black executive in first class. Top airline official humiliated, issues career-ending report. Blogs, tweets, and headlines spread the story like wildfire. People were shocked, not just because it happened, but because it happened so casually. In his small apartment, Captain Rick sat alone. His phone buzzed again and again, messages from colleagues, emails from the airline, but none of them said what he wanted to hear. "You're safe." He turned on the TV. The news anchor was mid-sentence. "The airline has not confirmed if the pilot will be fired, but with Mr. Jordan Wells personally involved, experts say it's only a matter of time." Rick threw the remote across the room. It hit the wall and broke. But that didn't change the truth. His career was falling apart. Meanwhile, at airline headquarters, Mr. Wells stood in front of a boardroom full of executives. He wore a dark blue suit, calm, controlled. But his voice was firm. "This was never about revenge. It's about respect. If a man can't treat a stranger with dignity, he doesn't deserve to wear this uniform." The room was silent. No one argued. In another corner of the city, the co-pilot sat at a coffee shop. He looked out the window, thinking about everything that happened. A young flight attendant walked in and said quietly, "Do you think he'll ever fly again?" The co-pilot shook his head. "Not after that," he said. "Not after who he insulted and how." Back at the airport, passengers remembered the man in seat 1A, the one who never raised his voice, the one who never demanded attention, but who, with silence and dignity, changed everything. The little boy who had watched it all from economy class, he told his teacher at school, "I met someone strong on the plane. He didn't fight back, but he still won." His words touched the whole classroom. Even the teacher wiped away a tear. At home, Mr. Wells sat quietly in his study. He looked at a photo on his desk, his father, long gone now. A man who had once been denied a seat at a diner because of his skin. Mr. Wells whispered, "We made it, Dad. Not just to first class, but to change." 1 week later, a new captain stepped into the cockpit of Flight 207 Young, calm, respectful. The airline had made its decision. Captain Rick was officially removed from duty. No press release, no long explanation, just a quiet ending. To a loud mistake. At headquarters, Mr. Jordan Wells stood by the window looking out at the runway. The chairman stepped in behind him. "You handled it well," he said. Mr. Wells didn't smile. He just replied, "People like him don't shock me anymore. What shocks me is that it still happens." The chairman nodded slowly. "You taught the company something, not with power, but with patience." Later that afternoon, Mr. Wells walked through the airport quietly. He wasn't wearing a suit today, no name tag, no title, just a regular traveler. As he passed through security, a staff member smiled and said, "Welcome back, sir." And, "Thank you." He nodded back. Simple respect, no announcement, no special treatment, just how it should have been all along. At a small school, that same little boy who had seen everything sat at his desk. His class had a role model project. Most kids picked superheroes or athletes, but he stood up and said, "My hero is a man who sat in seat 1A. He didn't yell, he didn't fight, but he showed everyone how strong he really was." The class clapped, and his teacher whispered, "That's the kind of hero the world needs." Back in the city, Rick packed his pilot uniform away. He looked at it for a long time, so many years of flying, but one moment of pride had crashed it all. He whispered to himself, "I thought a seat made a man important, but now I know better." Meanwhile, Mr. Wells boarded another flight. This time, he wasn't in first class. He chose to sit in economy, beside an elderly woman. She smiled at him. "You sure you're in the right seat, son?" she joked kindly. He smiled back. "Yes, ma'am. Respect doesn't live in a seat. It lives in how we treat people." As the plane took off, he looked out the window. Above. The clouds again, but this time lighter, freer.